The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone participating on this TOCPA webinar. And my name is Neres, and I'll be the moderator of today's webinar, Thinking Processes and 5 Focusing Steps by Jelena Fedurko-Cohen and Humberto Baptista. So we have our speakers here online. Jelena.
Hi, everybody.
And
Hello.
Humberto.
Hello, everyone.
And we have our rules of the game the same. So we have probably Jelena will start because her screen is shared. Then we'll have discussion. Humberto chips in, and probably we'll have some question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So, Jelena, stage is yours.
Okay. So I know that last time there were difficulties with the sound that came from my computer when we were doing the webinar. Now, if somebody doesn't hear me well, or there is some, I don't know, difficulty, it's muffled or echo, can you please write to Nerius, and then we'll try to sort it. I'm presenting from a different computer now. It may be that my computer is compressing sound actually in the wrong way. This is what happened last time. This webinar is the continuation of the one that we had about a month ago when we were discussing the core cloud for supply chain. The initial idea was also to discuss the TP and 5 focusing steps. But the subject that we took last time was so big and the discussion was so interesting that we simply ran out of time and we couldn't take the other subject, the TP and the 5 focusing steps, or the 5 focusing steps and TP. So now just we want to focus on this area now, just with Humberto. And we will present our views. I will present my views. Humberto presents his views. We will be discussing like in between. And if you participants, just if you have questions, please write these questions to us. And then if there is something that really you would want to ask during while we're discussing a specific point, please write to in the box of questions, like mark it somehow, write urgent, and then Nerius will know that he will read this question before we move to the next point. Otherwise, it can be difficult to return back to the point when we have already developed it further. Good. So, as I said, this is the continuation of our talk a month ago. When we speak about the 5 focusing steps and the TP, we actually have to remember that 5 focusing steps is a thinking process on its own. It's a process because it has sequence. There are 5 steps. And it has a very concrete deliverable to be achieved by its end, by the end of this process. And of course, intermediate deliverables by the end of every step. But it is a process, and it is a thinking process, because it is a different algorithm to seeing the system and to making decisions about managing the system than the conventional ones. What I want, before we go into the details, just what I want to mention is that every step on this process historically has its issues among those who know TOC or who know of TOC. Like just reading a book on TOC does not qualify for knowing TOC. It's certainly to know of TOC, to hear about TOC, just to get the first flavor of it, but not to know TOC. So when we're looking at step 1, identify the system constraint or constraints. The major areas of difficulties here are understanding the concept of what is a constraint and agreeing on where the constraint is located. These are the areas where people disagree, people fight, people go into being unhappy with each other because of different perception of what is the nature of the constraint and also where the constraint is. And it's not necessarily people that belong to the same company or the same system or the same implementation of a solution. There is also quite a lot of different interpretations and different points of views among the people who have learned and practiced TOC. These difficulties, as I can say over the now just 20 years experience, come from two areas. From two most common mistakes. Mistake 1, perceiving a constraint as bad. It is a mistake because constraint is neither good nor bad. It is just a part of the system. Using constraint wrongly is bad. Not knowing where constraint is bad, but constraint itself is nor bad nor good. It is an element of the system, and it will be there. It will be there one way or the other. There is no system without a constraint. And the second most common mistake is giving an obstacle the status of a constraint. An obstacle to achieving the desired results. So this was one area, two mistakes. And the second area is this difficulties about what is the constraint and where it is, comes from a desire of a consultant to get easier buy-in to their consulting service or product. It is significantly or perceived to be significantly easier to sell a solution or a product if it is announced to companies that this is a solution, a service, a product that deals with the constraint, that addresses the constraint, that this is the solution to the constraint, rather than this is a solution how to subordinate in order to exploit the constraint after the decision was made. To say that the solution is for the constraints, specifically for the constraint, is certainly fancier, catchier, rather than not to say that. So in my experience, these two areas, mistakes and a desire to get an easier buy-in, are the things that bring difficulties to the area, to the area of what the constraint is and the 5 focusing steps.
Can I add a couple of things there?
Absolutely.
So just complementing, and I'm in full agreement with the points Jelena is raising here, just complementing a little bit for seasoned TOC practitioners and newcomers as well. The discussion that goes in the second point, the where the constraint is located, it's often a futile discussion with the clients because in most cases, there are exceptions, of course, but in most cases, the mentality of local optima and the way parts of the system are disconnected or think they're disconnected prevent them from really understanding where is the constraint in their organization, even after they understood properly what the word constraint means. After that, still there is a huge discussion because their mentality is the mentality of disconnection of each department on its own. And even though they recognize they must work together, they're not prepared to understand the cause and effect and the impact of the one part of the system in others. So for them to really come to the conclusion where is the constraint without help from someone who does not have this bias, it's very, very hard. So this is I agree very much with Jelena with the problems that she raised there in the bottom part of the slide. And in this part of where the constraint is located, to simply go and ask the client, it's usually a recipe for a long and fruitless discussion.
Absolutely. Well, I agree absolutely. Look, if sometimes even seasoned TOC practitioners cannot agree whether the constraint is in the market or in the capacity, or a suggestion that the constraint is in policies, then yeah, how can a client, then it certainly makes no sense to go and ask a client where the constraint is located. We know how to identify which machine or which work center in the process, in the flow, is a constraint or a bottleneck if it is inside. So, well, I think that we have enough experience and we know how to read the signals to be able to identify it. But that is, well, I completely agree with you, to try and get this information from the client, especially with a straightforward question, look, where is your constraint? Is, as you correctly said, it's a recipe for stalling, for not moving further, for a lot of fights, and it doesn't give any value. I agree completely.
And there is another one that sometimes people with some experience in TOC get trapped into it, which is very problematic in itself, which is discussion where should the constraint be located. And that's another whole chapter. I don't want to spend too much time, but please be aware that if you're not really comfortable answering where it is located right now, don't go into the discussion where it should be located. There are many other implications there that may stall or even harm the implementations quite badly if we get into those without the proper prerequisite steps being done in the order they should be done.
Absolutely. Look, it is actually pretty straightforward. If you do not have an explicit bottleneck, and bottleneck is known in the company, then it makes no big actually difference for the start. Even if you have your constraint inside, which means in the flow, it's a capacity constraint. Well, the moment you start using logistical solution and buffer management, and you start record the reasons for being in red, it will very quickly lead you or give some identification where, or some hint at least, where the constraint might be located, a specific place. And by the way, constraint is not a process constraint. If it's a capacity constraint, it's a place. It's a specific machine or specific resource. Or if it is actually in the market, then you will also start getting the signals just from the reasons to understand what is giving you troubles. So it's like buffer management. If you're applying logistical solution, buffer management is certainly a very good tool to help identify where the constraint is. Humberto, agree?
Yes, very much so.
So, shall we move on?
Yes.
Okay. So, now just there's an issue with step 2. The first thing is, or what needs to be thought about step 2 as a step of a thinking process, that the wording says decide how to exploit the constraint, not exploit the constraint. And this is extremely important word, decide how to exploit the constraint, because the decision also takes into consideration strategic interests, the situation with clients, and decide means that you have to give a very precise instruction with all these considerations, instruction to the system. And this instruction is given through a plan, step 2 is always a plan. The manifestation of step 2 physically is a plan. To make this plan,
yeah,
one must know correct algorithms and formulas. This is what I have to say, or I have to say about step 2.
I
Step 3.
want to add that
Yes.
on step 2, Jelena, I don't know how many times, and a good bunch of those was in the company of Jelena, Oded, and many friends in Goldratt schools, have to put in bold, red, neon, flashing the word decide.
Mm-hmm.
Both for the reason that Jelena just pointed out, which is this is a plan, this is a planning stage, and you are taking the step to see how you will extract value from the constraint. And this is the decision that we tenderly refer to as exploiting the constraint. And the decide also does have a very important psychological component. It's a decision. A decision implies a certain degree of arbitrary component to it. You must take a step and say, hey, I don't know everything. I don't know how everything will act or react. I know a good deal of my system. And with this limited but solid knowledge, I'll have to make a decision. It might not be the perfect, it might not be the optimum or whatever, but I need one decision to organize my system around it. And that's why it's important here to emphasize the not only the planning angle, which is very, very important, but also the conviction, the positioning that management and ownership of a system must have on the decision they make on how to extract value from the constraints. That's why I keep, from the early days that I started working on TOC till now, emphasizing so much the word decide there in step number 2.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Okay, step 3, subordinate everything else to the above decision. It is about execution. While step 2 is planning, step 3 is about execution. It is the most difficult step because it requires putting all the pieces of the puzzle together in such a way that it will work and allow the constraint to give the utmost and not to waste anything of the little that we have in the flow, the little of the constraint that we have. So it is a lot of concrete actions to do to achieve the plan from step 2. Well, do you want to add something in step 3 here, Humberto?
Yeah, I think step 3 has the flip side of the coin of step 2, in the sense that we are subordinating everything else to the decision, not to the constraint. Mm-hmm. And that's something I always have to go back to, because people tend to think, oh, we're going to subordinate to this machine or to the department. And the answer is no. We're subordinating to a decision, to an organizational or company-wide decision. And that's what guides the plan, right? Guides the execution of the plan. And people think we're subordinating like a hierarchy to a part of the system. That's not it. That's subordination to the plan. That's how to execute a proper plan, not to change the power or relationships within an organization or a company. Okay, this is completely different. And sometimes people go back to the step and they tend to confuse the two. And that's also a trap that we need to help people understand, because the way Goldratt written was very succinct and very short. And sometimes people skip a word, and skipping one word, it makes a lot of difference. So this is one thing that we might be aware as well. On this step has enough difficulties as it is. Properly executed, it's rather difficult. So we have to strive to make clarity be as large as possible, as obvious and as explicit as possible. Otherwise, the difficulties will mount, and the probabilities of failure will also rise.
Yeah. Look, a bad execution can scrap the most excellent plan.
Totally.
Yeah. So step 4, Elevate the constraint means adding more. It does not mean removing. Elevate means give more, upper, bigger. So where does the perception of removing come from? From the same two most common mistakes: perceiving a constraint as bad and giving an obstacle the status of a constraint. If it is an obstacle, then what we need to do is to overcome it. Obstacle needs to be knocked down, removed, or you overcome it. But one way or the other, the obstacle must stay behind and stop blocking you on the way to achieving the results. You don't remove the constraint from the system. You can move the constraint from the system, but not remove. You can remove it from that place and move it to another place by your decision. That is okay, and by the actions. If you elevated the constraint to such extent that something else has become the constraint, then by elevating constraint in step 2, by adding more to the system of what was not enough, you move the constraint to another place, but did not remove. So, and here is a very interesting thing. I always recommend people I work with to check whether they are speaking about an obstacle or whether it's really a constraint. If we speak about an obstacle, then, and let's say just quite often we hear like bad policy is a constraint. So now if it's an obstacle to achieve better results, then in step 2, we must decide how to use this bad policy utmost. And in step 3, now we must subordinate all our system to this bad policy. And in 4, we must add even more of bad policy to the system. It doesn't make any sense. If you say not policy but any other obstacle, just try and check it with the word obstacle. You need how to exploit the obstacle, use the maximum out of the obstacle. Then in step 3, you need to subordinate all the system to this obstacle, or to the decision how to exploit this obstacle. And 4, just add more obstacles on the way to achieving the result. No, that is ridiculous. But if we say you need to change it to something else or to remove it, that's clear that we are speaking about an obstacle and not a constraint.
This is a very good distinction, Jelena. And I also like to point out that there is a vice and a bad habit of people who are not aware and not intimate with the 5 focusing steps to miss a few of the steps and think they have done the first step and jump directly to the 4th. This is very common in many areas. I jokingly refer to government news on the media, because every time you see there's a speculation where the problem is located at. It's at best a speculation. They're not really checking it thoroughly. And then they jump to, we need more money. And then that's it. No discussion on what are we doing with the resources we have. Is this really the problem? Are we really achieving the plan to utilize the resources, the limited resources we have? Nothing of the sort comes in most discussions. So it's basically doing the step number 1 halfway or badly done, and then jumping to step 4 in whatever the person involved or the persons involved think should be elevated, or meaning need more money or more resources, or without really a thorough concern of how things are used, right, and how things are used. And this is very, very damaging. So the 4th step has this very interesting element, which is we must get to it only in its own time. If we get to it too fast, we didn't do properly the previous three. Okay, the third one is quite difficult. So if you, after 2 minutes, are number 4, something is wrong. Okay, and that also comes to some of the discussions that we sometimes have in step number 1. So, for instance, a very short story about a case of a friend of ours, Professor Ronan, when he went to a hospital many years ago in order to help them utilize better the surgical rooms. And just by looking at the flow, the usage was quite low. It was not even 40% of usage. And the thing that blocked and stopped them from getting more was the absence or delay of the cleaning of the room. And one discussion was, oh, should we name the janitor as a constraint, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously that's not the case. The surgical rooms are the constraint, but adding more would help janitors. And that's why some people try to get away with these things and miss a little bit and muddle, not Professor Ronan for sure, but other people sometimes muddle the waters with the discussion of what is a constraint. And even though some things are not obstacles, they're not interesting or convenient to name as a constraint, because they're not something that we can really have good plans to organize the organization around them. So if we do a good plan to exploit the capacity of janitors, really, that's not how we want to organize a surgical ward. We should have some other things that people could relate better and would be better suited to subordinate to. So sometimes the constraint it has to have some considerations and be something that really helps the organization grow without a lack of clarity or difficulty for people to understand and other things that force them into doing mistakes while following the focusing steps.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, Humberto, I think that you want to switch over to your screen.
Yes, I think it's better.
Humberto,
can you make it?
Yeah.
So I'll enter presentation.
Yes.
There we go. So we just covered a brief recap, and it was a very good one, because if we want to talk about the focusing steps, there are many problems that people face around them. And as Jelena pointed out, they are thinking processes on their own. They induce a thinking on a specific order and with specific deliverables in each step. And one thing that Jelena triggered in my mind, and I wanted to capture here, when she was going back to my first provocation, if I may call it so, when I connected the thinking processes with the 5 focusing steps, using the TOC solution for distribution as an excuse. I use this as a background to make a claim. It's a claim for us to discuss, is a claim for us to understand the limitations and validity of the claim. And I noticed something from Jelena's comments, and I thought it was very interesting, which is we have many moments for the thinking processes as we think, not the 5 focusing steps, but the thinking processes as we name thinking process. We have different moments to use them. So for instance, when we encounter a new environment that we know nothing about, or we don't know enough about, we might think that, oh, I need something different here. To manage this environment, I need to develop a TOC solution. It might be even a generic solution. Let's say we want to improve traffic in a city. That's not a common TOC solution, right? It's not established, it's not PBR, it's not CCPM. We're probably gonna need to do something different. And TP might have a good hand in that, right? And it will help us. If you see some of the presentations by Oded, he uses to explain his logic behind a generic solution, a TOC generic solution, using the TP. I'm not sure he used it to construct it, but at least to explain it, we can see. And if we want to develop, I have seen cases where the TP helps developing a new generic solution. And there is another moment when we have a generic solution and we want to apply it to a specific environment. And Jelena pointed this out. And my comment was more in the first moment, which is how to develop a new solution. And Jelena read it because I was not explicit there in the second moment, which is apply the solution to specific environments. And there is a very interesting and a little bit different relationship between the 5 focusing steps and the thinking processes. And there is also something I left here as the continuous usage. Yes?
Humberto, wait, Oded wants to say something.
Oh, yeah, there you are, Oded.
Yeah, sorry, Humberto. Yes, I just wanted to say some words regarding the first point that you have raised. And actually, if we're going historically, you're absolutely right that the TP was more used in order to communicate the application. It was first of all internally to our team, yes, because there was a need to explain the logic of what it is and what is the uniqueness about it, and in a way it was more like at least somehow at least in the original logistical solution, he came with the solution first, and then in the process of communicating it, used the TP and actually developed the TP in order to make it happen. So for many years, and definitely when we're talking about the production, the CCPM, then the TP came after the actual development, but it's definitely was a major tool for communicating it, and in some cases also maybe recognizing that there may be some missing entities in the future reality that called for more explicit actions or putting in place even injections in order to supplement it. Distribution, I think it was already a combination by which a distribution solution has been there, definitely in Ellie's mind, and it was presented immediately under the TP. I think that there are very few examples of full applications that was based under the TP, but fully agree with what you have said so far. Yeah.
Thank you, Oded. And that means that usually the second part, which is where Jelena focuses, is the more common one, which is, okay, we already have an application. Now we have a specific environment. Let's try to match the two. And sometimes the match is not perfect and we still have to do something about it. And TP can help there. And obviously in monitoring and improving the solution, there is also some usage for the TP, even though the solution it's rooted in the 5 focusing steps. Monitoring how it's going, how the plan is effectively executed, what happens when we have a shift in the constraint and so forth, may call for going back and improving the solution. So I think the TP has a role there, but the extent of this role is what interested me. That's why I made this provocation and this statement. So going a little bit, we just did this part of the recapping of the steps.
Sorry.
Yes?
Humberto.
Yeah,
sorry. Just wanted to add to that is that unfortunately in the marketplace we come into cases by which sort of developing a specific application for a specific environment, yeah, is something that is perceived by the consultant as something which is juicy or add some uniqueness to their presentation. And in the past, we've seen people that were sort of redeveloping the current reality tree of production, where production is very well established as a CRT and so on, leading to nearly the same core problem, also core cloud and so on. So from this point of view, we have also to take into account that sometimes sort of overusing it or using it when it is not really necessary, because you can apply the modification to this specific environment and still use the same core, rather than taking the company through the whole process of redeveloping the thinking processes. Because to be frank, in like 20 years ago, maybe even more, there was an assumption that the best way to communicate the problem is the current reality tree. But over the years, we have come to the conclusion that the quicker we are coming to the core conflict or the core cloud, the better, because this will give us the direction of the solution and carry on from that. And I see that more happening now recently by not by the veteran, of course, TOC practitioners and experts, by some that just have partial knowledge, read half a book here or half a book there, and present themselves as knowledgeable and add it to their portfolio of offering, and by that causing a bit of confusion and misperception about what is the role of the TP. Back to you, Humberto.
Thank you, Oded. I think, well, I agree with these points you raised. I think it's very common. We do have sometimes an unsolved dilemma between a person's intellectual interest or how he values himself and presents this value to the clients in sides that are not beneficial to really implementing and delivering results, and rehashing things in using the TP or overusing the TP. It's certainly a way that I've seen this done, not as many times as you or that, I'm sure, but I've seen done a good number of times as well. And I think we should try to help people understand there is a need to focus. I mean, the focus meaning not doing many things and doing a few things properly. And even when we love these things, we need to understand where are they really applicable and needed. And the TP it's a great example. I mean, we have very big discussions, and I'll take this a couple of moments to take notice of these discussions with dear colleagues and friends in the community, which started discussion saying, oh man, TP, it's fine, but it's not really TOC. TOC, it's 5 focusing steps and what stems from it. While this is an intellectual and somewhat interesting discussion, there is one thing that I noticed there, maybe 2 things which are relevant that I noticed there. One is the following, it's a technical one, which is we don't have a formal linkage and explicit linkage between the two. That's why I kept thinking about this and saying, if we had this explicit linkage and the linkage was known, then we would have less discussion whether these belong or not to the TOC knowledge, okay? But also it's a matter of how people define TOC. So I'm not getting into the issue of the definition of TOC right here. The second thing is there is a little bit of resistance on the part of some practitioners on discussing the core assumptions surrounding TOC and TOC solutions, processes, and so forth. And they think this will scare away the clients and will cause a bad impression. I think this is a very poor understanding of TOC and what Ellie Oded wanted for TOC. in my view, and this is very Humberto's personal view, and Oded, Jelena, please feel free to add or complement or contradict my views in this. And my view is that Ellie Goddard wanted us to have the same degree of impact, of growth, of evolution, of improvement in our personal relationships, in human-based organization, as we do have in scientific engineering fields of knowledge. When you look at science and engineering and technical-based fields, you see the advance is exponential. What we developed last year alone may be bigger than what we developed in a couple of millennia backwards. So we are growing faster. But when we look at people's relationship, at organizational problems, we see the same things that we heard 100 years ago, maybe more. So my take in this specific aspect is that Ellie Goddard wanted to make a science of managing human-based organization. His last book, which was not finished, was not entirely written at all, we just have the introduction, was called the Science of Management. And he always wanted to stress the scientific thinking. And in the scientific thinking, the discussion around the assumptions, the challenging of assumptions, the deepening of the understanding, it's paramount. It's of huge importance. And that's what shows the strength of the field. If the field doesn't have this kind of discussions becoming stale, nobody wants to fund it, nobody wants to make any research in it, it's a dead field. A live field in science is one that we go deeper, that we go from Newton to Einstein, we go from Einstein to the quantum physics and beyond. So this is the real signal that TOC is alive. It's this kind of discussions that we go and we challenge each other's assumptions and we try to go deeper in understanding. And by going deeper, our solution will have a wider impact. And this is very scientific. When someone looks at it without the scientific view, then comes this kind of concerns or unsubstantiated fears that the discussions may have some negative effects. If we really explain what TOC is about, I see only positive effects from that.
Humberto, I actually have a very brief comment here. I think that it is not correct to put the sign of equality between TOC and managerial science. TOC may be a part of that, but it is certainly not like just what, well, an example that you gave just about physics, like Newton to Einstein and so on. Well, it's still physics, but even in the area of the physics, just there are specific areas, specific knowledge zones, knowledge pockets, where the assumptions of Newton laws stand. It doesn't make sense to challenge the assumptions of Newton's laws within Newton law, because the whole laws are based on those assumptions. You may ask and challenge whether it is this Newton's law represent whole physics or not. This is an absolutely different story. I do not see the logical smoothness in saying, in order to develop TOC, let's challenge assumptions on which TOC was developed. Maybe in order to develop managerial science, we may challenge assumptions on which TOC was developed, saying that this is more to that. Within TOC, the assumption is that all parts of the system are connected through cause and effect. The moment you challenge and you negate this assumption, there is nothing of TOC left. So I agree with you of the benefit of challenging, but this is in order to develop a complementary. And I cannot say that it is bigger or deeper or instead. I'm saying to develop another facet of managerial science. This is just what you were referring to. but it makes no sense to challenge the three basic assumptions of TOC: cause and effect, yeah, just which leads to convergence, removing the conflicts or ability to solve the conflicts, manifesting that there is no conflict, should not be conflict between local and global, but those conflicts are actually instituted in the system by us because of our behavior, of our measurements, of our assumptions, and the way how to work with people based on respect, which means we should allow people room and provide them with the tools to express their reservations and their concerns. I don't think that it makes sense, in order to develop TOC, to try and prove that these assumptions are wrong, because something will be developed of that, but it will not be TOC, and it is good.
We are playing into different definitions in the same word here. The first thing is I am meaning not just the fundamental assumptions. I'm meaning all the assumptions we carry in TOC, maybe explicit, maybe not explicit. Oded just mentioned one, that we did have an assumption in the past. It was an assumption because we didn't prove it, that the CRT was the best tool to communicate a specific situation. Nowadays, we have different views. We challenge this assumption in different ways, right? So I'm looking at all the assumptions we use around TOC. And sometimes, and frankly, I don't have any hypothesis or new idea to offer, but I'm just saying that sometimes when you challenge an assumption, you don't challenge it in the void. You don't challenge it just to say, oh, it's untrue. You challenge it and replace it by something else. And that was interesting between Newton and Einstein, or from previous understanding to Newton, was challenging an assumption and substituting it by a more generic one, a more widened impact one.
Absolutely.
And so I don't know if any time there will be something that will say, oh, we are not explicitly cause and effect, but something similar. And what will that be? I don't know. I was just meaning that we have to take into consideration the full set of assumptions, not just the basic ones, when we talk about evolving TOC.
Absolutely. Look, what you're saying right now is extremely important. Knowledge develops. The knowledge can develop only with the application of it and seeing how the reality responds to applying knowledge. And you may have a very good logical check, and you believe that the reality will behave according to a logical check. You check logically your assumption, as you said, that CRT is the best tool to explain the problem. And until there's no better tool, this assumption is correct. It is the best tool until a better tool is developed. And then, so it is generally, what you're saying is that we keep on proceeding from a specific concrete element which is inside the assumption, instead of substituting this element with a more generic one. It's like CRT is a best tool to present the core problem or core conflict, but then we have learned that it is not CRT, that it is a core cloud is the best tool to present the core conflict. So it is not, well, and this assumption, yeah, and this assumption can be changed after a better tool can be developed. But for now, for the period of time, it is the assumption and it is the best tool. And by the way, not necessarily for everybody, for somebody in their concrete situation, concrete environment, CRT can still be the best tool.
Yeah.
Well, is this what you meant? That you meant
and
that
there's another assumption there that will separate the two, and this is evolving the field, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but being rigid about the assumption is extremely dangerous. It is like about the policies. Yes, in haystack syndrome, Goldratt does call a policy constraint. But then there were more applications and more understanding, and it was clear that it's not a constraint. And Eli was saying that himself. But the point is that it was written once. Because it was written once, 20, 25, 30 years ago, this does not mean that we cannot say now that after more knowledge and more practice and more experience that we collectively have gathered, now we can say that it was the understanding of that time. And now the reality has proven that this understanding is right now improved. Yeah, here
exactly.
I completely agree with
This
you.
is exactly my of the evolution of TOC as a scientific body, because scientific bodies of knowledge evolve by comparison with reality, not ideology,
Absolutely.
not anything else. It's reality that tells us where we should check.
Correct.
Right, and then we eventually evolve. But that's it.
Yes.
So
Correct.
I think
Good.
now,
Agreed.
just making a little bit of time buffer management here. I'll just flip to the slides I just put here for us to talk about this moments. And I was wondering, it was really something that stemmed from a couple of experiences I had on the developing solutions, and then I'll pause in the slide that Jelena built of the using TP on developed solutions, so implementing solutions. And as we noticed, the TP tools are based on cause and effect, explicitly noting cause and effect between elements of our understanding, right? And mostly we write this down as quantitative cause and effect. Sometimes we put some clarification, saying most times, or the majority, or the minority, and a very few times we really put like 12% or something. But the tools are made themselves to be capturing relationships of, if this happens, then that will be the effect. And this is what we're looking for. The existence of cause and effect is more prominent than the degree and the timing of cause and effect. So the linkages are basically geared towards that. That's a good enough simplification for most problems and most environments, but it does have some limitations. And these connect back and relate back to the 5 focusing steps. So if we can look at them quickly here, and I've just put a few names for us to remember and to compare. We have a cloud or a group of tools. They represent what we are trying to model with the thinking processes. And each step of the thinking processes address a different aspect of the modeling of realities, be them current realities or future realities, or the transition between the two, and so forth. And on the other side, we have a different process, which is the 5 focusing steps that help us simplify, manage, and achieve more of a complex system. And then the question is for us, how these two talk to each other, right? On developing a new application. A new application might be a specific application for a specific niche, or a generic, full-fledged, full-blown application. I'm not saying we should do this every time, but sometimes we do have. So when we go about it, we have the 5 focusing steps. And when we go about the first step, we already discussed that the constraint is a concept that sometimes eludes people, right? And I just put down here something I learned actually from Oded a long time ago. And I just put some observations to make it clearer, right? Which is, constraint is not a blocking factor, it's something that determines the throughput or the global performance of the system, right? And we measure it as advancement towards the goal. And we have some signals that in the TP tell us, and I put signals between quotes because I don't want to make it too formal a word, but it gives us some hints that we have a gap between the current and expected performance. And if we do a proper treatment of the UDIs and we really connect them to the goal, then we should see that, oh, each UDI we have, it's a hint that we're not moving and not getting enough of the goal as we would like. And therefore, They may give us some idea of what is the constraint of the system, but they don't help us pinpoint the constraint. They just need that whatever the constraint is, there is still some way of using it that is not getting us as much as the goal as we would want. So that's why we have the UDIs appearing, right?
Humberto,
Yes, Jelena? Go on.
That UDIs
Okay.
can help identify or even just to see the direction where the constraint may be. So and UDIs, yes, well, I see that this is written. Well, that's I agree with you. They do not help pinpoint the constraint because it's hidden in quantitative assumptions that will generate the UDIs. But that's why having UDIs is irrelevant for as the tool is irrelevant for the notion of constraint tool. Constraint will be there in the system. It will be. We know by definition that one link must be the weakest. So constraint will be. In fact, if there are UDIs or if there are no UDIs is not relevant to the fact that there is a constraint. And the fact of an UDI is certainly not relevant to, and even the content of the UDI is not relevant to where the constraint is. Let's say resources are not always available when needed. Does this always identify or hint or kind of give us an idea that the constraint will be in the capacity inside? Can we have situations when we have the market constraint and resources still not available when needed? Oh, yes. Or there is too much or some SKUs have overstock and some have shortages. Does this say that the constraint is in the market? Not at all. It is not at all. That's what I'm trying to say, that UDIs and constraint is there all the time. And we know that it must be there. It's neither good nor bad. It is there. And the fact of UDIs, I cannot link in any way an UDI to any way of helping identify the constraint.
Exactly. We are in violent agreement here.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make the comment.
Yeah, no, but it's a great comment, and it triggers in my mind the following concepts. One is the constraint. It's a constant presence, as Jelena just said, and UDIs, they are somewhat dependent on our expectation, not only on what the system is producing, but what we expect. And depending on how we set or how our expectations are set, to be better said, we might have UDIs or not. But even if you do have very well worded, very ambitious UDIs, whatever you can think of, they will not help you pinpoint the constraint. Okay, the constraint does not relate to these effects. We are seeing effects of the existence of a constraint, but it doesn't tell us where it is and why it is the constraint. And then this is hidden in some quantitative assumptions. And as the tools don't deal a lot and don't have explicit mechanisms to surface and validate and scrutinize quantitative assumptions, we are not helping very much the step number one with the thinking processes. That was one of my realizations when I started to cross between the two. Can I go to step number two, Jelena?
Yes, please.
So in step number two, there we start to see some interest, some traction, okay? Because now we are talking more closely in terms of the effects UDIs represent, for instance, and what we want to decide upon. Okay, what do we want to decide in step two is how to get more from the constraint, but meaning get more not just in volume, but get more throughput by utilizing better the constraint, meaning I don't want to waste it, or I want to capitalize in a different way, or something like that. And looking at the UDIs, we might have some tips, because some of the UDIs, especially the ones that are connected to the market demand or connected to the throughput generation aspect of the CRT, they talk about problems connected to the exploitation of the constraint. It might not be the final decision. We might look at them and decide something different, but at least they're closer in terms of cause and effect and in terms of the proper mechanisms for us to have some good inputs to the discussion of how to exploit the constraint and help people decide upon it. What do you think, Jelena?
Yes, I think just then we will have like my views just when I will present them. I agree that about deciding how to exploit, people will take into consideration their strategic interests or targets that are placed, the strategic situation in the market. Sometimes it can be presented in current reality tree or future reality tree, but neither current reality tree or future reality tree is in any way a prerequisite to decide how to exploit the constraints or constraint. There is no way that that one can say that in order to decide how to exploit the constraint, we must first build CRT and FRT. There is no way whatsoever. When we do P and Q, when we build the mix, we decide how to exploit the constraint. We didn't do any CRT, any FRT. It is just not needed. When we work with a simulator, the Goldred simulator, GC, we work with plant 10, with any other plant, then the first thing that needs to be done, we must make a decision on the mix. Mix means what to produce and how much of what of each product. And then you do not proceed from any CRT or FRT elements. You do not proceed from any TP tools. When we say think, of course, we proceed from logic. We proceed from 5 focusing steps. We proceed from cause and effect, yes, but not from specific TP tools like a cloud or CRT or ambitious target or FRT or UDI. We do not.
Gaps, yes.
Gap, yes.
Gap, yes. And the UDI can be a representative of a gap, but when we actually develop this process towards finding a solution, then it's more getting the reality versus the expectation that is saying, thing in my decision making, something in the algorithm that I've been using is not working as I would expect it to work.
Yes, this is making, just when you say about the gap, is when you look at the performance of previous period or periods, and we see that we didn't meet the target, and then we know that our plan was not the best plan. But this is the gap from the previous periods, is the manifestation that we need to do better on our plan or better on the execution. We may have had perfect plan, but execution was lousy. So, and then the gap from the previous period allows you to see whether the plan was bad or whether the execution of a good plan was bad or whether both were not good. This is the gap. But and then based on the analysis of how the system operated in the previous period against which we are right now comparing, or at least we're measuring, from there, when we look at the persistent problems during that period, which may be linked to UDIs in this period, then yes, here I agree, they can be the signals where we should focus. But this is only if we do the plan for the similar or for the continuation of operations, based on the execution of the plan in the previous period, then yes. Otherwise, I do not see how it is connected.
I agree with the point that the team thinking processes tools are not a prerequisite to the step number 2, but sometimes they may help. That's why I chose the word help here. And I agree also with Oded that sometimes the gap signals possible exploitation schemes or exploitation opportunities. The scheme is already given sometimes, and you just want to make it better, or sometimes may suggest a different one because that one is it's nothing that we can close. And but the tools themselves, specific tools, are not a prerequisite. Sometimes they are inspiration. I can think of, for instance, if the distribution CRT have been done before the development of the solution, the question of deciding how to exploit the constraint, meaning I don't want the customer to go into the store and be frustrated by finding something he does not want or not finding something he wants, could be coming from that. But it's not a prerequisite. I agree that it's not a prerequisite. Sometimes it's an inspiration, or it's a common background to help the discussion, right? I think it's much closer than in the first step. In the first step, I see a huge chasm between the TP and the first step. And I see a closer relationship. It's not an explicit or a necessary contribution, but it could be an interesting addition to the second step. And that was my take here. And thank you both also, because you gave me different ideas on how to approach it. Can I go to step number 3?
Yeah, hold on. Well, I completely agree. It is one thing that TP can be used anywhere. So it's a difference now, whether it is a prerequisite or a necessary condition for the step to operate, or whether it can be used within it. TP can be used within any situation. So I completely agree with you.
Yes, and then you pointed out before, and Oded as well. In spite of it being possible, the question is should be, and sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is not now. It's not a good use of our time, and our time is a major constraint. So we should be careful when applying things, especially things we like, because then we tend to apply them more often, because sometimes they're not the thing to apply. I am a passionate guy about the things I do, so I tend to be vigilant not to fall into this trap, and sometimes I fall into it, I have to confess, and I need to be vigilant, because even though it's possible, it's not recommendable, right? And I learned a long time ago, even before I came into TOC, when I still was a computer scientist, the difference between the word support and the word allow. And it was a very funny thing. The story was the following. I was studying computer programming. And in computer programming, you have several types of ways and styles of programming a computer, and the language we use sometimes allow you to work in one of these styles, and sometimes they support you to work on these styles. And I never understood properly the thing until I came to a very interesting book. The book was at the time object-oriented programming using assembly language. Assembly language is the lowest form of a computer language. It's almost writing in the code that the machine understands directly, which is machine language. And it's just a matter of translating the numbers to words, but the structure of the language is the same as the computer understands. So it's a very low level. It's not a very sophisticated language. And when I read this object-oriented programming with assembly language, I was like, wow, this is weird. And I tried to read the book, but it was torture, because although it was possible, it was a bad usage of this beautiful way of programming in a language that allow it, but does not support it. And then I read a book by a famous programmer who developed more high-level languages called Nicholas Wirth. And he said, it's not enough to claim that you are object-oriented or any other philosophy if you allow it. It's only enough when you support it, when you really give explicit support for that. So in this sense, I think that TP does not give explicit support to step number 2. It may allow it, it may even help it a little bit, but it's not explicit support. We don't have specialized tools, or the tools we have are not specially designed for that. Shall we go to step number 3?
Yes, please.
Okay, so in step number 3, I think here the TP brings a lot to this step. I think here it shines. The impact on the other, of one part of the organization, the others, it's quite well captured in the tools. We have many tools that illustrate this, from the reality trees to branches, to sometimes to clouds and so forth. Conflicts and dilemma are really a major headache in the creation of subordination plans, especially in companies which are not accustomed between local and global optima. And in the moment we try to design and execute plans, and sometimes even to perfect the plans, the TP help a lot. I mean, I've done this a good number of times, not only in developing the solutions, but obviously in implementing them. So I think here we cover a lot with the TPs. The TP, it's not that TP covers everything. No, I don't want to give this impression. I've seen in my experience as well that certain areas are very poorly covered by the TP. I have one example right off the bat. There may be others, I'm sure I'm missing a few here, like developing KPIs, developing measurements. I mean, there is a possibility of understanding and developing measurements using the TP, but I think the connection here, it's much less strong, it's much weaker than the connections with the points I've made before between understanding the impact.
Just let me add here. Just what you're actually saying is that when you say not covered by TP, you mean that there is either no special tool that will be for developing, for example, KPIs, or that there have been no recorded experience, recorded application of which of the tools to use for developing KPIs. You mean that, correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay. And I mean, I would love to be proven wrong here. It would help my life significantly. And because it would show me something I like being used in a way I never managed. And believe me, I've tried. And I was not successful fully in a way that I say, oh, this is really effective. I can use this once and again, and it delivers solid results on the vast majority of cases. I have to confess, this is something I have not yet succeeded in doing in areas like KPIs. But in other areas here, making plans and solving conflicts and understanding the interconnections between parts of the system, which is paramount. It's absolutely necessary to understand number 3, is to understand the connection between all areas and the decision we made in step number 2. So some good grasp of interconnections is needed. Obviously, I'm not saying that it's you do a CRT and it's done, it's finished. That's not it. But here, not having these tools applied will make your life very, very, not very, but significantly more difficult than it should be. What do you think, Jelena and Oded?
Yeah, we're okay with that. Yes, absolutely. We're on the same lines.
Good, good. And if you're not, I'll be also happy because I want to further a bit my thinking. So I think number 3, we have an interesting intersection, because every time we go back to step number 3, we keep on banging the idea this is the most important and most difficult step. Okay, it's not to say that the others are not important, but the implementation, the proper implementation of number 3 is a challenge. Once done, it's huge impact, but it's not like trivial. You don't snap your fingers and number 3 is in place. So seeing a good fit, a good intersection, and a significant help from the TP to number 3, I think it's a very important linkage. If there were no other interactions between the 5 focusing steps and TP, I would be happy, because this is a place that needs a lot of help, and people are not used to making plans that integrate and synchronize a whole organization, a whole company. So I think this is a very good point. I think they have other interactions as well, but this for me is like the foremost one. Can we go to step number 4?
Absolutely.
So in step number 4, it's basically what we just covered, right? Elevation means getting more, sometimes at a cost, sometimes no, right? But we want more capacity. And capacity have many forms, right? Capacity means sometimes you change the mix and something it's easier to process in the constraint. That would be a type of exploitation. But sometimes capacity may be, oh, I have a different agreement with the union, so people can work more hours, or I can run another machine to do that, so I can offload something, and then so forth. Sometimes I go to the basic solution, which is I buy more capacity or hire more capacity. But capacity have many shapes and forms, and sometimes they are known and described in our reality trees. Sometimes they are away and outside of them. And the tools in TP and the way we use it now, they do not cover usually the quantitative element of expanding the capacity. Okay, so there is no explicit support, and here I put support in italic because I refer back to the little story I just told you about allowing and supporting. And TP allows for the notion of capacity. Have people trying to introduce new symbols and elements, but frankly, I never seen it done in a practical and straightforward way to really support the notion of capacity of quantitative elements. And frankly speaking, elevating many times falls into this category. And if we don't support it explicitly, the usage of TP here is going to be like marginal at best. So that's my take on step number 4. What do you think, guys?
I have here a very interesting comment. If we look at the 3 points that you have marked, and especially the use of the word capacity to the constraint and the examples that you have given, it's clear that you have been speaking about the capacity constraint, but there is also market constraint. And what is written here, and again, I'm saying the examples that you have given right now says that, and actually it's another proof that people sort of naturally, it's easy for us to interpret constraint as something inside the system. But the market constraint is, it's actually, yes, it's inside the system, but it is on the entrance to our system. It is still the amount of orders that company, and market constraint is the amount of orders that company gets from the market. And if the capacity is bigger, internal capacity is bigger than the demand on this capacity that has come in the form of orders, then we have the market constraint. So in this case, elevate the market constraint, actually exploit the market constraint will be the same. The meaning is the same. It is not to lose the little that we have. And for market constraint, not to lose the little that we have will explicitly mean serve every order that gives you positive throughput, and positive is not within the noise, but positive. And do not lose any of the customer that is there with intention to buy. It's like not necessarily even with order yet, but is there already. Offer more to the same customers, even if they do not place orders for your, very few customers would buy the whole product line or all SKUs that you're producing. So this is what means exploit the market constraint. But when we speak about elevate the market constraint, then it's very, very awkward to say that we must add more capacity to the market constraint. It is only if you will sort of try to interpret is more capacity to give more orders, but it is not about the capacity that that market is lacking in giving the orders. It is the interest, or it is the perception of value, and so on and so on. So then elevate the constraint generally will be along the lines of offering or going to new markets or developing new products, not offering existent products to the clients who do not buy them yet, but developing new products. It can be new products, new markets, and all the other combinations that go around that. It is generally to increase the value. So
yes,
it is just was my comment about the capacity. It is misleading here.
And
yeah,
the link to the TP is very, very strong in the elevation of a market constraint, because all of the development of special offer, mafia offer, you name it, it is based on, heavily based on the TP. And so here I think that it we can add a fourth point to say that when we are dealing with market constraint, the TP is actually heavily supporting the development of ideas for elevating the constraint.
And again, the wording of this first three just should then be very clear, or at least there should be two columns here with capacity constraint and market constraint. Does it make sense?
I think that's a very, yes, it makes a lot of sense. And I think here, well, you highlighted something I forgot to highlight in the second point when I was talking about coming from inside or outside the system. And I agree that capacity is not a good word here. Probably we should have something like volume or yeah, I mean, I cannot think straight ahead of a better word than volume, and it still doesn't sound perfectly capable of covering both sides, like internal and external constraints, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes elevating the constraint in the market is straightforward. It's like investing more in sales and marketing, and sometimes it's really breakthrough solutions. And then I agree with Oded. And anytime we inject a new idea on the elevation of a constraint, the impact of the TP is huge. Not only TP, also the buying layers and so forth, but the TP in itself, it delivers a lot of impact on the way we try to bring new demand into the system, right? So I'll probably rewrite this. This is just for us to discuss upon. And my expectation was just exactly for you guys to challenge it. And I agree, there is a strong linkage here. I'll probably expand my little bubble that I drawn on top of number 2 and 3 and put it a little bit on number 4 of the impact or the intersection between the thinking processes and the 5 focusing steps. And I agree with that. In the developing of new solutions, the TP for new offers for the market, the TP, it's very, very powerful. It might not be needed, right? But I think it's of great importance. It's a strong link. I agree with you on that. It's a very, very strong link there. Okay. The step, I think it's not very, very, very critical here. We do have some ideas that may stem from TP, but it's nothing intrinsic, which is sometimes when we see the constraint shifting and we have not noticed it explicitly, we're going to see certain type of UDIs popping up, right? And they'll signal the subordination processes are failing, and things will probably start to look in a way they shouldn't, and we'll notice, okay, the constraint may be shipped or broken. And also, speaking of broken, if we talk about misleading words, to break a constraint, it gives more impression that we
remove it in this place.
Yeah, but we need to, it's in this place, but it's not explicitly said in this place. So it might be understood wrongly as eliminating a constraint. It's just shift, right? There is no breaking of a constraint. It just moves from one place to another. It keeps on existing forever. There is no system with infinite output, right? So there's always a constraint somewhere, and it shifts. But okay, was the word that appeared, and we have to add clarity to that, right? And I cannot think of anything else that might intersect here. What do you think?
I think that what you're mentioning as UDIs will not be UDIs. The system already works on 5 focusing steps. Then in the system, there must be a mechanism that gives you the early warning of something starting to go wrong. When we are speaking about a logistical solution, it will have buffer management because it will have buffer. The reasons for being in red will show you before it will become an UDI. When we are in red, it means we have not endangered the result, the measurement of the system. We are not in black, we are in red only. And we must have enough time and enough bank of corrective actions to rectify the situation and not to allow us to get into black. We endanger and create the gap with the measurements only if we are in black. And we should not be in black. We should not allow to be in black, because we should take corrective actions in every concrete place, concrete time, concrete place. And then we're using buffer management for PUGI, which means we collect the reasons and we see what is the next area for improvement. UDI is a problem that has been there for quite a while. Everybody knows about that. Everybody speaks about that. Actions have been taken to remove it. It would go for some time, maybe, or maybe even not. But if it goes for some time, it comes back. UDI is a persistent problem. So I think what you are speaking here about, not UDIs, but sort of reasons for red from buffer management. But it is certainly the situation, if we are already on 5 focusing steps, the situation should not deteriorate to creating new UDIs. Does it make sense?
It makes. I have a couple of comments on that, and thank you for triggering those in my mind. First, when I read what you wrote here, I noticed that if we're envisioning an UDI and not seeing it in reality, we're just talking about the potential UDI, right? So there's no sense talking about envisioning an UDI that does not exist. It makes sense if it's a potential UDI. And I agree with you that when we do have the proper buffer management and the PUGI in place, we should not reach this stage, right? But there is nowhere in the 5 focusing steps saying that we must have buffer management and the proper usage of buffer management to drive PUGI in place. I wouldn't do it without it. Please understand me. I'm just saying that's an assumption we are doing right now, proven by many instances of our encounters with reality, that we assumed that the whole mechanisms of buffers are effective and are the best way to go about certain elements of exploitation and subordination, and will prevent us from falling into some of the things I mentioned here. But it's an assumption. It's not explicitly stated in the 5 focusing steps. And I agree with you. When these are in place, we should not see this kind of potential UDIs popping up. And I just mention it because I many times notice that we don't reach the stage in the logistical implementation. We don't reach the stage that the proper recording of the entries in red is done and dealt with. So if that was like the rule or the most common case, great, then probably we wouldn't have a need to think about it. But unfortunately, it's not. And I agree with you, Jelena. I think our efforts would be better spent not trying to apply something of the TP here, but to implement the PUGI using the buffer management.
Well, I think you just have raised something very, very important that regarding the 5 steps, because if you look on the original 5 step of focusing and the original definition of the constraint, yes, it was sort of like the constraint is anything that prevents the system achieving higher performance versus its goal. And within this verbalization, it contains the goal and the performance, which has a performance measurement. And when the definition of the constraint have been updated to how much the system can perform, or the factors that are determining how much the system can perform, we in a way lost the explicit of the goal and the measurement of the goal. Okay, and if you made a reference to Boaz Ronen originally, many years back, he extended the 5 steps into 7 steps, and it said determine the goal, determine the measurement, okay, and then comes the 5 step of focusing, and then alongside the 5 steps, there is always the reference to the goal and to the measurements, and hence, don't care whether it's buffer management or any other mechanism, that all the time is looking on the dashboard and said, how are we doing versus where we want to be? So I think, Humberto, that this was a very, very good point to add to all of this discussion. Not to forget actually that the origin and the issue and the importance of that is that for us it is so obvious, and it is inherent that of course we are checking everything against the goal and the measurements, and yet we can have a situation where, which is because it's not explicit inside there, we may be losing the implicit.
And I have a comment about the notion of a potential UDI. I generally do not think that such thing can exist at all. UDI is a persistent problem. How can you know that it will be potentially persistent problem? A negative outcome, yes, absolutely. But how can you envision a potential UDI? By claiming that there is a potential UDI, you claim that you see that something potential negative will happen, and you claim that you are not going to do anything about that and will allow a single occurrence to deteriorate to an UDI. I can hardly envision this alongside the TOC applications or TOC thinking processes.
Even though, as you may say, it has been said like 10, 15 years ago, is that we're looking to develop a solution that will remove the current UDIs and will not create future UDIs. But as Jelena said, this on itself is maybe a nice slogan, but actually, yes, we're trying to prevent negative branches, because once we have a solution that contains either the 5 steps or the thinking processes or whatever contains TOC, we will not allow new problems to become persistent UDIs. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, it's a nice discussion about what you're raising. Yep.
Oh, thank you, and I'm glad that we're putting these points in the air, right? And I agree with Jelena, and never quite adopted the term potential UDI, and I have major fights with very known members of our community about what an UDI means, and they come with examples for me, and I say, this is not an UDI. How come you let a client say that's an UDI? A broken leg is not an UDI. Right? Sorry, if you want to do the metaphor of Goldratt with the mountain and the pot of gold, that's another matter. But in his life, a broken leg is not an UDI. and then, frankly, sometimes we leave these assumptions, and we think people will carry the same assumptions that we do underneath the terminology, and but sometimes it's not the case. So maybe we ought to think of something to help us make those assumptions explicit and help people understand what we mean when we say UDI and other terms like that. So I think it would be nice if we could come up to the view that Jelena presented. Is that okay with you guys?
Yes, yes. Yes.
So after I did this, I did a quick stab, and that was in my original presentation on the TOC distribution solution. And I said, and I provoked this discussion, I'm very happy that I did, that the thinking process has a huge intersection with these two, and maybe only these two. And then, as we have seen here, the fourth step also may have a good contribution from the thinking processes, but other steps are not as much affected. So Jelena made a very interesting points, and my read, please correct me if I've read it wrong, Jelena, is that you were looking at when we go into a certain place, a certain environment, and we say, oh, I have a solution that fits this place. But obviously, each environment has its own characteristics and own situations, right? So when we try to implement a specific generic solutions, we might encounter some elements that need to be tuned or specialized or really implemented in that environment. And Jelena did this in a very interesting way. She put this, and should I animate it, Jelena?
No, just let's go back to just to me. Nereus, can you give me the screen? Nereus, thank you.
There you go.
Show the screen. Here we go. Thanks a lot. Okay.
I'm not seeing your screen right now, Jelena.
You should be. So,
there it is.
So, yeah, thanks. So here is what you just what you're presenting then, and you have used this slide now at the end of your chunk where you're saying developing solutions. But what is written on there? Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Go on.
So, but what is presented now on the right side of this table, on the right side of the steps, is not for developing, but already for applying. Because as you said yourself at the very beginning, it is, and as Oded confirmed, it is not that the TOC replenishment solution was developed by Goldratt and the people around him by explicitly putting the clouds and the negative branches, like explicitly thinking was there, absolutely. But when we say thinking processes within the framework of this webinar, we mean specific set of tools, logical tools. That's why just what I was showing and what I will show right now in the next slide, that this is actually about the application of the solution, what is written to the right, which is on the right hand. And I have copied it. Now it's the same 5 focusing steps, and the content from just in this column right now, in the middle column of your slide, and my views on that. So Now, when we speak about the first focus step, identify the system constraints. What does it require? Knowing how to compare the existing capacity and demand. If capacity exceeds demand on this capacity, we have market constraint. If capacity less than the demand on this capacity, we have capacity constraint. At least this very broad distinction. Step 2. And this is not TP. Knowing how to compare the existing capacity and demand, there is no tool in TP, and there is no need for any tool in TP to make the comparison. Now, the second one, decide how to exploit the constraint. Decide how to exploit is the plan. And when we are speaking about the replenishment solution, we need to decide on, to build a plan on what is key use in what locations, and we need to do the calculation of buffers, how much. That is not a TP. The third one, subordinate everything else to the above decision. We need to determine and arrange frequency of replenishment, batch size, dynamic buffer management and reaction, pricing and payments. We also need to have bank of corrective actions, and as you were correctly mentioning that, we need to be sure about the investment. So the upper 4 points, not TP. When we speak about the bank of corrective actions and about the investments, well, what will be used? Negative branch, obstacles, and IOs, intermediate objectives. There could be clouds here. Shall I go for this or shall I go for that? I don't really see it, the practical use of the cloud. There could be. Cloud can be anywhere. Well, shall I go for this corrective action or for that corrective action? I don't think so. What we see in reality, we compare delta throughput with delta operating expense to create this throughput or to remove this negative branch. And if we have several options, we go for the most effective one from the point of view of the least resource consuming, fastest, and most sustainable. I do not see there a cloud. The fourth one, elevate the constraint. For the constraint, clients that enter the store to buy, which is in the middle column next to identify, which is what you recorded there from the work of Eli Goldrat. So for the constraint clients that enter the store to buy, elevate will be selling more to the same clients and bring more buying clients, which means we must find solutions how to sell more, and we must have investments, both for promoting the solutions, first for developing the solutions, then investments, as you were saying, for the stock, right? Just buffers. Buffer is an investment. Buffer equals investment always, because it's inventory. So here it could be cloud, could be NBR, could be obstacles and intermediate objectives. I do not envision any CRT or future reality tree to be instrumental. Of course, it can be used. Well, just people write hundreds of pages, tens of pages of CTR and CRT and FRT for absolutely no practical use. So this is intellectually entertaining. This is all right, but I don't see any practical use out of it. So, and the fifth one, well, just if the constraint was broken, not to allow inertia. So here, just it's about buffer management for identifying where to improve next. It's PUGI. And the buffer management is not a TP. The buffer management is just actually statistics. TP can be used in deciding or building sort of a plan how to realize, how to implement this decision on what we will improve next. Then yes, but otherwise no. Okay, so this was my take, and I think that the details we have already discussed when you were going through your part with your view.
Yes, I think so, and I think your comments here are very interesting, especially in the light of the reading you made of implementing it. I think it's a very good reading, and we see also the idea of encompassing the fourth step here, also with some interaction with the TP. The comment Oded made was perfect. And we see now, I think, after this brief discussion, but very interesting in my point of view, that there is a good degree of intersection, but it's not parallel. It's not perfect parallel. It's not a perfect intersection. It's not even a prerequisite characteristic of doing TP before the 5 focusing step or anything of the sort. But it does have a few, but maybe worthwhile points of contribution to the 5 focusing steps. But it's important for people not to think that one is a prerequisite to the other. It's a helping tool. It's sometimes a very effective communication tool, and sometimes it's a very powerful tool in developing breakthrough solutions, especially in certain elements of the 5 focusing steps. But it's not a necessary one, right? And and I think that we cover it pretty much. I think if we have questions and comments from the participants, it would be a nice point to have them. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that first of all, the discussion is really welcome. And in the end of the day, these are two facets of who we are and what we are doing. And not always we are only thinking one way and going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or just using the thinking processes and don't think at the same time about the constraint and the relationship to the constraint. So I believe that we are. This is they are both within us, okay, and both of them they are needed and supporting and allowing, yes, us to work, because we have always the system view, and we look on the system and we want the system to perform better, and we will utilize from our tools, from whatever we have in the arsenal, and sometimes we will bring some other stuff, because we are very focused toward achieving the purpose and the benefits for the system.
So, Nereus, I do not see any questions. Do you?
No, I don't see any questions as well. I think
Well.
This can either be a good sign or a bad sign.
No, I think it's a sign that people need to do some thinking before asking.
Yeah.
Okay, then.
Might be that. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm always game. I'm always willing and welcoming discussions on these aspects. I think at least in a personal note, I get a lot from them, and as often as I can,
we enjoyed that.
Yeah, and I try to encode them and put them in the open, right? But I really enjoyed these guys. I hope I could meet you more in person. If we cannot, we can meet like this. And
sure.
When we meet
Humberto,
and discuss.
Hop on the plane and fly into us. Well, we are now in Think Camp. This is an absolutely outstanding place to think about and about the important things and to develop things. You know, just we have sea right here, 50 meters from we have our piece of beach, which is a very cold beach and very cold sea, but still. It's a very nice bench there, and we have the fire that is burning there, and the fireplace inside the house as well.
Yeah,
so it will be nice to see each other in person. Nereus knows what we're talking about.
Yes, and you know, you said that winter for you is is a nice season. So basically, Estonian summer is like Brazilian winter.
Yes, and I'm hoping that. So it's a lovely invitation on both accounts. So thank you guys, not only for the invitation, but also for the opportunity for us to go about and share these ideas and discuss and check our assumptions and hopefully grow new ideas from them.
Okay,
and
guys.
thanks for raising the issue.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for your insights. Thank you, participants, for listening. And if you have any questions, please email them either to Jelena or to Humberto. And have a nice Friday, how long it's left, and have a nice weekend. And see you on our future webinars. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.